Welcome to day 37 of the New Way. I'll begin by reading John 2:13 through 25. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market." His disciples remembered that it is written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews then responded to him, "What sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." They replied, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you are going to raise it in 3 days?" But the temple he had spoken of was his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said. Then they believed the scripture and the words that Jesus had spoken. What should Jesus have found in the temple courts? The temple court was the area set up as a place of worship for non-Jews. All were welcome to come and pray there. It was called the Court of Gentiles. Essentially, this area had been taken over by a flea market. Pun intended. We'll talk more about this problem when Jesus cleanses the temple a second time, close to the end of his ministry. Right now, I want to know, why in the world would you sell cows and sheep and doves inside a temple courtyard? Well, these animals were used for sacrifices. Let's take a generous view of what was happening and say that it may have started as a convenience to those travelers who came a great distance. It certainly was easier to buy a cow or sheep or bird to sacrifice than to bring it long distances. But by Jesus' time, it had become something much worse. Let's investigate behind the scenes and see what we can discover. Before you could sacrifice an animal that you had brought from home or purchased somewhere else, it had to pass inspection by a priest. If there was a defect, you could not sacrifice that animal. That's God's law, and those defects are spelled out in the book of Leviticus of the Old Testament. But in Jesus' day, the priest just about always found a hidden defect in your animal, not based on God's law. Then you had to buy a new, quote, temple-approved, quote, animal at a ridiculously high price. But they would cheerfully buy your defective animal at a ridiculously low price to take it off your hands. What do you think happened to these supposedly defective animals? My suspicion is that in a few weeks those defective animals would suddenly recover and be sold as temple-approved animals. And the priests were getting rich doing this. So Jesus was a little ticked. No, he was livid. He made a whip from some cords and ran everyone out of the area. Let's see. Blocking Gentiles from worshiping God, lying, cheating, fraud, and that was just the priest. Let's just say that Jesus turned their business upside down. The next two verses are a foreshadowing of future events that we will discuss later. John 2:21 through 22. But the temple he had spoken of was his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said. Then they believed the scripture and the words that Jesus had spoken. So let's go on to verse 23, John 2:23. Now while he was in Jerusalem at the Passover festival, many people saw the signs he was performing and believed in his name. But Jesus would not entrust himself to them, for he knew all people. He did not need any testimony about mankind, for he knew what was in each person. Remember that Jesus created humans, so he knows us very, very well. I believe that these verses just mean that Jesus didn't get excited about whether people were happy with him or not. His value or worth or self-esteem was not based on popularity. What do you base your value or self-worth on? In his service, Dale.